Wild Bill on Wars of Attrition. Ultimately, winning a war depends more upon the conviction acquired one side or the other that the war can no longer be won than it does on any special battle or defeat or superiority in men or material. For instance, the Soviet Union lost millions of men in casualties in World War II, additional to millions of innocents in the lands where all the fighting took place. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Hungary, the Russian SSR, and they, the Red Army and its leaders, never quit. Great Britain had her insides scooped out and served on a plate in France, Tunisia, Italia, and elsewhere. She never quit. Japan lost millions. Thinking of her as an Oriental and Asian nation blinds us to how small her population really is, how much of it was destroyed in the war. Her people were starving, dressed in rags, but still, they were willing to die if enough of the hated round eyes died with them. China lost millions, had already lost millions, and would soon enough again lose even more. But she never gave up her fight against foreign occupiers, even while her citizens were beating crap out of each other in a war for national identity. India has been bled white and bled of art treasures, cultural heritage, and mineral resources before by white supremacist groups and governments. I'm not mentioning the East India Tea Company or the Victorian government specifically, but certainly you do belong in that statement. But World War II exacerbated this drain. She never gave up, all while jerking the imperial chain as much as she could, short of armed insurrection. I'll look up Nehru and Gandhi. So casualties, rape, pointless murder, pillage, property damage, and draconian occupation do not necessarily cause a nation to give up the fight against an invader or an occupier. War, as Sun Tzu, Mahan, and Clausewitz viewed it, is a struggle between economic interests as represented by governments and or lobbyists and other influence groups. In that wise, military action is but one of several tools that one government can use to apply pressure on another. World War II was such a war. In fact, its initial aggressors were resource-poor nations seeking balance against those enemies whose growing control of world trade was unbalancing a system that had, with notable interruptions, stood for 10 centuries. Fighting that war between resource-poor nations on one side and resource-rich nations on the other, destroyed Germany and Japan as coherent factors in world trade. Their post-war reconstruction merely allowed us, the victor nations, to keep wages down, and so prices of imports down too. Here's one way it works. The science of war against enemy supply routes. When the German Navy, their Kriegsmarine, battleship Bismarck made a commerce-raiding sortie into the briny blue Atlantic in company with heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, her battle group commander, Admiral Lutjens, was tasked to kill a greater value of Allied ships and trade than had gone into their, Prince Eugen and Bismarck's, construction and the training and equipment of their crews. Optimally, it was hoped that the pair of modern warships would account for hundreds of thousands of tons of enemy merchant shipping and the goods those ships carried, a very profitable trade-off, the sort of attritional warfare that the West could not long stand. Ultimately, however, it looks like the United Kingdom's accounts of her, Bismarck's, destruction were somewhat modified to make the Royal Navy the victor in the expected, brutal way, rather than attributing the loss of the largest German warship to the meatless ignominy of a scuttling by her crew. Still, a battleship in a running fight is vulnerable to chasing shot, and the stern section is not available for examination. It is quite possible that, rather than beaten down by the steel fists of the Royal Navy as advertised, the Bismarck found herself with her Achilles tendons, her prop shafts, and reduction gearing ruined, in effect neutering the great ship without subduing her will to fight. I wonder what Hitler thought when the great commerce raiders were so summarily defeated, some by guile and trickery, some by radio intercept, and a few to serendipity. So much money, so much industrial effort, wasted, and for what? His war was a continental war, and he was a continental strategist. The guerre de course might appeal to him, on the one hand, as his resources were so limited they precipitated his commitment to a war of aggression, but on the other hand, his enemies could well afford their losses while he could not. He well remembered the Emden and other great war commerce raiders, whose record was a shining example, of course. Universal radio communications and the switch from coal to oil had changed all of that forever. Inter-service rivalry, which still afflicts us today, is one of the factors, of course, for Raider could not apportion long-range patrol craft to the Bismarck's benefit. Goering was also a continental thinker, and those four-engine Marine patrol craft were his. They were not to be seconded to the Kriegsmarine in promulgation of a naval strategy. The Japanese and the Germans, and in all fairness the Soviets, were forced to apportion naval elements in penny packets. There never was any hope for them to command and defeat the Allied navies, not in a hopeless one-to-one elimination series or in an arms race. One side of that strategy worked, then and still works now. But is it decisive? Consider the resources in men, material, and weapons and tools of war that the Allies deployed and maintained to hunt down commerce raiders, especially submarines. These were by far in excess of those spent by the Axis on their pinprick attacks on convoys and solo shipping. Indeed, it is safe to say that the Axis came closer to winning the Battle of the Atlantic in terms of Allied warship assignments and their cost, transiting and remaining on station, than ever it did with interdicting raw supply. Taken from that point of view, the Bismarck plus Eugen Kampfgruppe did its job and did it extremely well, just in terms of the oil that the Allied units spent on her detection, pursuit, and destruction. Add to that all the mountains of foodstuff, ammunition, repairs, and wear and tear on materiel, and you might well purport that the Bismarck won its war. Bismarck, Scharnhorst, and her sister Gneisenau and the merchant raiders were extraordinarily effective by that measure, even if the outcome of the war was a foregone conclusion from the first. And I grieve with the families affected by those lost and never to return until the sea gives up her dead. Wild Bill.